The past few days have been crazy for the emulation community. If you haven't heard already, Nintendo has officially taken down the Nintendo Switch emulator Yuzu. This was a legal process that seemed to have been resolved within a single week, since Yuzu decided to settle with Nintendo for $2.4 million. And now, all that's left of Yuzu is the farewell message on their website. But how did this all happen? And more importantly, what does this mean for video game emulation in the future? Well, I know a lot of this legal stuff can be hard to understand, so I'm going to try and break it down in the easiest way possible. And of course, piracy is illegal, and any potential endorsement of it in this video is simply for entertainment. But first of all, we need to establish that piracy is not the same thing as emulation. In the simplest terms, emulation is a piece of software or hardware that emulates or imitates a video game console. Legally, there is nothing wrong with the term emulation. There isn't any law that has ever actually outlawed this process. Piracy, on the other hand, is the unlawful copying and distribution of games that you do not have the copyright for. Piracy is illegal, however it is a crime that almost always goes unpunished. There's many reasons as to why, but ultimately it's just impractical to prosecute. There's just way too many people doing it, and it's not worth the resources for companies to go after. The reason why emulation and piracy are so intertwined is because of how much emulators inherently propagate piracy. The mere existence of something like a Nintendo Switch emulator will naturally move certain groups of people into figuring out how they can obtain the game file on whatever device they're choosing to emulate on, and nearly every time it's through illegal means. This is incredibly important for the Yuzu case especially because this is one of the main points Nintendo has on them. While they were still active, Yuzu decided it would be smart to try and make some extra profit through Patreon. Here, they were able to connect their users to tools and get around the typical anti-piracy measures used by Nintendo. But not only that, Nintendo argued that Yuzu was using Patreon to distribute an experimental build of the emulator to play The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom early. And technically, this is all true. However, in reality, it's a little more complicated than that. While it is absolutely illegal to pirate games, is it illegal to sell experimental builds of your emulator on Patreon? Does the law even have any sort of precedence for something like this? Not to mention, is it illegal to guide people in the right direction if they want to pirate games? Well, honestly, the answer is maybe. When the law gets into a gray area like this, it's usually best settled in the courtroom. Obviously, if you were conspiring to commit a crime in real life, that is illegal. But if you were unknowingly doing something that's illegal, it's not always a crime. It sounds a bit confusing, and that's because it is. Listen, I'm no lawyer, but the first thing you'll learn in a college business law class is the incredible amount of nuance in these kinds of lawsuits. And when Yuzu was presented with this lawsuit, they almost immediately folded. Like, genuinely, they didn't even put up an attempt at a fight. I remember seeing the news of the lawsuit on my phone one day, and then a few days later it was already settled. Well, picture this. Imagine you're the company behind Yuzu, and you see that Nintendo has sued you for profiting off their product. Do you even have a defense here? I mean, probably not. I mean, you were technically profiting $30K a month off of people wanting to pirate games and play them on Yuzu. I also heard that one of Yuzu's Patreon exclusive builds allowed online play in certain games. So in this situation, why would you want to waste any more money on legal fees and whatnot on a lost case? They probably just decided to take the L and move on. That being said, that L is massive. I mean, 2.4 million isn't nothing. As for Yuzu's final message, they basically left us with the most lawyered up statement I've ever seen. Yuzu and its team have always been against piracy. We started the projects in good faith, out of passion for Nintendo and its consoles and games, and we were not intending to cause harm. But we see now that because our projects can circumvent Nintendo's technological protection measures and allow users to play games outside of authorized hardware, they have led to extensive piracy. In particular, we have been deeply disappointed when users have used our software to leak game content prior to its release and ruin the experience for legitimate purchasers and fans. Honestly, the worst part about this is how surprised they try to sound. instead of taking responsibility, they say it's our fault that we got into this mess, because we leaked games and played them on their platform, acting like this is the first time they've ever heard of pirating games. But now that everything is settled, what does this mean for emulation? I mean, for the everyday person who emulates games, should they be worried about Nintendo coming after them? Well, no, even if you're pirating games, Nintendo isn't going to come after you. The people who should actually be concerned legally are the developers behind every other emulator. At this point, we don't know if Nintendo only went after Yuzu because they were obviously profiting from it, but it's safe to assume that was a major factor. The other Switch emulator, Ryujinx, didn't make this same mistake, and they were not attacked as of the making of this video. Honestly, we don't know what Nintendo will try to do next, and in all likelihood, they could just move on from this and we won't see any more emulators go down. I think the most important thing about this whole problem actually comes from the emulator that was lost by sheer association with the devs of Yuzu, Citra. Citra is a 3DS emulator which has grown in popularity significantly since the discontinuation of the 3DS and the 3DS eShop. It has entered the ranks of emulators like Dolphin and Visual Boy Advance, which allowed us to play our favorite games long after they were finished on the store shelves. But now it's gone. Obviously, there's always going to be some copies of Citra and more emulators are out there, but the negative sentiment is still present. It just got a little bit harder to play games that aren't being sold anymore. Video game preservation is probably the most valid concern regarding this Yuzu and Citra case. Because on one hand, we can actually see how Yuzu might be hurting Nintendo's profits. However, Citra is not hurting Nintendo in the slightest. After all, they aren't even selling 3DS games anymore. Emulators are such an important factor in a lot of other places than piracy as well. Speedrunners use them to practice in the most efficient way possible, live streamers and YouTubers depend on them to make content, and even people who legally purchase a game will use them sometimes to play a game more optimally. I mean, can you blame someone who got Pokemon Scarlet and it played like garbage on the Switch and then they tried it on their PC and it was amazing? As for my personal opinion on the situation, it's hard to say. While I understand the potential damages that piracy can cause for certain groups of people, especially indie developers, do I empathize with Nintendo? I mean, there's a difference between being legally correct and being morally correct. Sure, pirating Switch games is something that probably shouldn't be happening during the lifespan of the Switch. I mean, they are still selling the games. But like, what if I just want to play Pokemon Emerald? How am I even supposed to do that legally without getting it secondhand? That is just how important emulation is for the preservation of old and retro games. Look, we don't know what's truly next for emulation, and as someone who literally grew up playing DS games on an R4 cartridge, you know my stance on it. But for anyone who's actively worried about the aftermath of this whole lawsuit situation, keep in mind, if there's high demand for something, there will be a supplier. Yuzu is not the only Switch emulator in the world, and even if more emulators get taken down, they will keep popping back up. But of course, you should never obtain games illegally. You wouldn't want to have Nintendo knocking on your door.